Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU Radio Hofstra University to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. Today, we're kicking off our series about the microbiome. That's the name given to the collection of microorganisms that normally inhabit our bodies. And we'll be talking about our growing understanding of its effect on a wide range of health issues. We thought a good place to start this series was a discussion of how our microbiome forms early in our lives. We'll be discussing the early development of the infant microbiome, how it's affected by food and the environment, and its impact on infant health. My guest is my colleague, Dr. Mariana Brewer. Dr. Brewer is a neonatologist at Cone Children's Medical Center at Northwell Health and an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell, and I'm delighted to have her on the show. Mariana, welcome to Well Said.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
In my intro, I gave a quick definition of the microbiome, but I'd like to have you expand on that a bit. Can you please explain what we mean by the microbiome?
So the term microbiome describes all of the microorganisms that live on and inside of our bodies, and that includes both the good and the bad bacteria, fungi, and viruses. So we think that to have a healthy microbiome means that you have a lot of diversity of species, so you have a lot of different types of bacteria, and they're in balance. So when you have a balanced group of bacteria, it induces normal immune development and hopefully prevents some diseases. You can have an imbalance in your microbiome, and that's called dysbiosis, where you have overgrowth of some bacteria and loss of others, which is associated with disease.
Okay, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that a little bit later, but just the basic concept here is that there are lots of co-travelers that we normally have in and on our bodies. Any sense of like how many microorganisms we're talking about here, or how many different microorganisms?
So the bacteria on our bodies, or the microorganisms on our bodies, actually make up 99% of the genes on and in our bodies. So it's a huge part of the genetic material that is on us that we carry around with us every day. And it's about 90% of all of the cells that are on and in our bodies. So it's a huge number.
So wait a minute. So let me just repeat what you just said. So 90% of the cells in and on our bodies are actually not us.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of stunning. So let's talk a little bit about where all this comes from. When babies are born, are they kind of a blank slate? Are they sterile and then get colonized by bacteria, or do they come into the world already carrying some of these microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and so on?
Infants are born with a microbiome, and initially the microbiome is very similar on all of their body sites, on all of the parts of the body. And as time goes on and the newborn is growing, the microbiome begins to diverge, and then you get different communities of bacteria in the skin, the mouth, the lungs, the GI tract, and that sort of develops over time. But we actually begin to be exposed to bacteria in utero.
So presumably the baby picks up whatever bacteria it acquires from its mother.
Right. So we have been actually able to identify bacteria in the placenta and in the amniotic fluid from the mom's vagina, GI tract, mouth, and the respiratory tract. And this was in cases where there was no rupture of membranes and the baby was actually healthy. So this wasn't like disease-causing bacteria. They were just what we call commensal bacteria, or normal bacteria that were found inside the placenta and amniotic fluid.
Well, that's really interesting. And I wonder if this is a relatively recent discovery, because I seem to remember being told when I went to medical school that the womb was sterile and that babies, until they were exposed to the outside world, didn't have any bacteria on them. Did I remember that wrong, or is this
No,
something
you did
new?
not. This is something new. So as we've developed different mechanisms for identifying the microbiome, specifically sequencing mechanisms, we've been able to identify bacteria that you can't usually culture. So before, if you took a sample from the placenta or from the amniotic fluid and tried to grow the bacteria, we didn't find any, so we thought it was sterile. But now we can use 16S sequencing to identify the bacteria, and you're able to find very, very low, you're able to identify bacteria that are found in very, very low concentrations. So that's why now we know that there's some in there.
And when you say sequencing, you're talking about actually sequencing the DNA of the bacteria or the virus, and so you can detect it in much lower quantities than you could have by the sort of older classic techniques of microbiology where you take a swab and you try to grow something in a laboratory to see if there's something there.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Do we know if there are any pregnancy-related factors that play a role in how this all gets started? In other words, any things about a woman's pregnancy that will have an influence on how her baby's microbiome starts?
So anything that would influence the mom's microbiome could influence the baby's initial microbiome. So, for example, if the mom is treated with antibiotics, which happens a lot during labor, that could have an influence, and also the mom's own microbiome. So we know that things like obesity can affect your microbiome, or having like periodontal disease or like oral mouth issues can sort of influence your microbiome. So that would influence the microbiome that the baby is exposed to during fetal life.
So really anything that affects the microbiome of the mother can have an effect on the early formation of the microbiome in the child.
Yes.
Huh. You know, one of the things that I guess is an important contributor to the microbiome is the actual birth process. I wonder if you could comment on how babies are affected by passage through their mother's vagina during a normal delivery, and how that might differ from a cesarean section birth, where there's obviously that passage doesn't happen, and so the baby isn't exposed in the same way.
Right. So the mode of delivery is a major determinant of the newborn's microbiome. So when they've done studies on this, they found that babies who are born by vaginal delivery have a microbiome that's similar to the vaginal flora of their mom at birth. And those that are born by C-section have a bacterial community that's more similar to what's on the mom's skin. And then after birth, all of the babies will have a development of their microbiome that is kind of predictable, with increasing diversity of species over time, and then other factors aside from mode of delivery start to play a role in how the microbiome develops.
Do we know if that matters?
We know that it's different, and we assume that because the more natural way of birth was vaginal delivery, that we're sort of comparing a C-section, which is sort of a medical procedure, to the normal or natural form of delivery. But I think that overall, you start off with a microbiome, and then there's so many other environmental factors that are going to play a role in the development, that the sort of the effect of vaginal versus C-section isn't sustained.
So they start out different, but then they kind of converge.
Right. They start out different, and then, they sort of start to develop over time. So the birth mode, although it is important, after the first 6 months, you're not going to notice a difference.
So what are some of those other things that do play a role in the ongoing development of the baby's microbiome?
The other things that play a role include exposures in the environment, exposure to antibiotics, the type of feeds that the baby gets, some things that maybe you wouldn't guess, like their vitamin D levels, or their exposure to furry pets, exposure to other siblings. So all of those things, and where they live geographically, can have an effect on the microbiome. So basically anything that they come in contact with can affect what their microbiome ends up looking like.
Well, let's talk about a few of those in turn. I think something that there's been a lot of talk about, and we actually did a show about this a year or two ago, is the difference between breastfeeding and formula feeding, and whether that has a measurable effect on the baby's microbiome. Can you comment on that?
So newborn babies are exposed to either mom's own breast milk, donor breast milk, or formula. And mother's own breast milk is unique because it's sort of a prebiotic, which means that it's a prebiotic and a probiotic. So that means that it has its own diverse microbiome with thousands of bacteria that have been identified that sort of live in the breast milk. So you're kind of giving bacteria to the baby, but good bacteria. We know that breastfeeding is good for babies. And it also has prebiotics, so like things that, like certain sugars that promote the maintenance of good intestinal bacteria. And then in the case, like we were talking about C-section versus vaginal delivery, they've even found that full-term babies who are born by C-section, if they're breastfed, their microbiome actually becomes more like babies born by vaginal delivery faster. So it can sort of help to normalize, in quotes, the microbiome, make it more similar to what would have been natural. The other forms of feeding, donor milk and formula, do not have their own microbiome. They're pasteurized to make sure that all bacteria are killed off for good reason, but it gets rid of both the good and the bad bacteria. So they don't really have that probiotic effect, but they do still have those special sugars, human milk oligosaccharides, they call them, which can contribute to maintaining good intestinal bacteria. Well, the donor milk does. Sometimes breast formula has them added, although that's not quite evidence-based yet. But because of this, the gut bacteria in babies who are fed formula and donor milk are more similar to each other than they are to breastfed babies.
Once again, do we know if those differences actually matter in terms of the baby's overall development and future health?
They may. I think that it's such a complex system with so many different things affecting how diverse the microbiome is and how it develops that we're not at the point where we can pinpoint one thing that says, if you feed your baby breast milk, they will definitely have a normal microbiome. I think it helps. And it is one of the factors that has the greatest influence on the microbiome for the first year of life. So that is known. But that doesn't mean that if you feed your baby formula, they're going to have a abnormal microbiome and be at risk for a bunch of diseases down the line. That's not necessarily true.
Yeah. So we talked about how babies are fed. I'm curious about some of the other things that you mentioned earlier that have an influence on the early microbiome development. You mentioned other children in the household, where people live. Can you talk about a little of those things?
So those things, they've sort of done studies where they looked at all of these different potential influences on the stool microbiome, and they sort of kept track of what has the greatest influence on the variability that we see. And they basically found just that in, having exposure to household siblings, having exposure to furry pets, and where people live sort of influence what microbiome we find. I don't think we have a good sense of good or bad for that. Yeah. It's just these things play a role in the microbiome that we develop over the first 2 years of life.
I always start to think about this in terms of the sort of pre-modern human existence where we were in less clean environments, probably with more kids around, certainly with more animals around. And I wonder if we're actually adapted biologically for a world that is less prevalent than the one that most of us inhabit.
Right. And that's part of the hypothesis that maybe us being in such a clean environment is related to like increased incidence of allergies or asthma that we've been seeing over time. I think that it may be related to this decrease in microbial diversity, leading to changes in immune development that sort of increase our risk for some of these inflammatory diseases later on. I don't think that there's a causal relationship at this point, but there's definitely a correlation between having abnormalities in your microbiome early in life and some things like asthma, allergies, autoimmune diseases. And in neonatology in particular, we think about the risk for sepsis or like having a severe infection early in life, the risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, which is a severe intestinal infection that babies can have, especially premature babies, and even infant colic. So some colicky babies have been shown a correlation between having that colic and that increased fussiness and crying and having an abnormal microbiome.
The connection there, just to kind of spell it out more explicitly. So as I understand it, the idea here is that if babies are exposed to a wider range of microorganisms and then have those wider range of microorganisms colonize their gut and their skin and every place else, then they become more immune tolerant, or kind of their immune systems are kind of smarter, and then they're less likely to develop some of these autoimmune diseases where the immune system itself is what causes the illness. Is that the kind of basic understanding here?
Yes, absolutely. So the exposure to all the different bacteria results in sort of the development of a mature immune system where you can identify bad things, bad organisms as bad, and identify yourself and good organisms as acceptable, or you become tolerant to them. So if that doesn't happen, you may have you can develop an increased risk of some of these autoimmune and allergic diseases.
Yeah. You mentioned premature birth as a factor in some of the issues that we've discussed so far. Can you just explain what that's all about, how that plays into what we're talking about?
So premature babies are also born with a microbiome similar to full-term babies. So in a vacuum, there's no real difference between the two, except that premature babies have very different exposures in their environment. So they are admitted to the neonatal intensive care unit where they're exposed to antibiotics, they're exposed to invasive treatments, intubation, tube feeding, placement of central lines or IVs. So their exposures are very different from that of a full-term baby. They're even exposed to resistant organisms that can be living in the hospital environment that you wouldn't be exposed to in your house. So even though they start out very similar, premature babies are at high risk of developing an abnormal microbiome or dysbiosis, where there's a imbalance between the good and the bad bacteria. And this is associated with some diseases that happen more in premature babies. So it's been associated with that necrotizing enterocolitis that I mentioned, which is a severe intestinal infection that premature babies get. And it's also associated with some long-term issues like chronic lung disease or bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which is sort of like a long-term respiratory problem that can happen in preterm babies that are born with immature lungs.
As a practicing neonatologist, is this something you actually kind of investigate and consider in your care of these small children?
To a certain extent. I think that right now the research on the microbiome and its role in immune development and risk for these infections is in its early stages, and in general, but in preterm babies, that always sort of lags behind the general population. So it is definitely an area of huge interest, and there are actually a lot of ongoing studies looking at the use of probiotics in the prevention of necrotizing enterocolitis in particular, which have been coming up with very encouraging results. The jury is still out, especially with regards to safety, but it is, I think, an up-and-coming potential treatment or preventive treatment in neonatology.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the issue of probiotics, because I think anyone who's walked through the aisles of a pharmacy recently has probably seen products on the shelves that are touted as probiotics, something intended to help the community of microorganisms in our gut. Is that something that parents of young children should be paying attention to, or should they walk right past that?
I think that we don't have enough evidence to recommend probiotics yet. For everybody to know, probiotics are actually live microbes that are sort of can be given and can be taken in order to try to make your microbiome be more normal or have more good bacteria. The problem with what's available on the market is that it's not regulated, so it's not FDA regulated. There's no guarantee necessarily that probiotic is actually still live bacteria the way that when it's in the bottle, or how much of it is it. There's not as much safety regulations that go into it. So I think that right now there's not enough evidence to say, like, everybody go out and buy probiotics for your kids. But I do think that it's a promising up-and-coming treatment, and that perhaps there are some children who would benefit in specific situations, like if you are being treated with antibiotics, you want to make sure that you maintain a good gut bacteria and things like that. So for right now, I would say, especially if you have like little ones that are, up to 4 to 6 months, exclusive breastfeeding is sort of the recommendation for those babies if it's possible. I know everybody can't exclusively breastfeed their newborn.
Sure.
But that would be a way to give probiotics that we know is safe. And then, be on the lookout sort of for up and coming research on probiotics, which they may be helpful. And some research really is showing that it is helpful, but it's just not, there's not enough information yet.
Yeah, not ready for prime time is what it sounds like. You mentioned before, we were talking earlier about the relationship or the potential relationship between disturbances or derangements of the microbiome and certain diseases later in life. But you also mentioned some things that might be evident even at a very young age. Are there things that parents and caregivers should be concerned about if they see their baby exhibiting that might point to a problem with the baby's microbiome?
Sure. So the signs of having sort of an abnormal microbiome are very nonspecific. So it could be related to like a colicky baby or a baby that, cries a lot, is very fussy, maybe having gassiness, diarrhea, things like that. That can also can be normal, and it doesn't have to be related to having an abnormal microbiome. But those are sort of the signs that you would notice because of alterations in the bacteria that can cause sort of more gassiness, bloating, abdominal pain, that, you could go to your pediatrician and sort of ask about.
For the youngest children we're talking about, you mentioned before that the best way to sort of maintain or restore a disturbed microbiome is mother's breast milk. What about foods, particular foods for kids that are a little bit older and starting to take solid food?
So I think that as far as that is concerned, you could, there are foods that are sort of, that are like sort of fermented foods that might have, that have their own microbiome. For example, yogurts or like things like sauerkraut that you could offer, and they're I don't think that it's evidence-based to say, like, give your baby a yogurt every day to maintain their microbiome. But the idea with introducing solid foods is to give a very diverse group of foods. So if you want a diverse microbiome, you want to give lots of different types of foods, high fiber foods, like basically the way that we all know we want to eat. We want to eat fruits and vegetables and variety so that we're healthy. You want the same thing for your baby, and that's what's been shown to help them develop a healthy microbiome. And that would include things like yogurt or, any sort of food that we all eat. The only foods that I would say to avoid would be something like honey, which we know can cause botulism in babies, so you avoid that for the first year. And then any sort of regular milk. So babies should only eat either breast milk or formula, but they shouldn't have like regular milk from the grocery store because it can cause anemia. So other than that, once you're feeding your baby starting at around 4 to 6 months, you want them to eat diverse groups of foods just like the rest of us.
And I'm assuming that along with that recommendation of the kinds of things we should be eating, we shouldn't be feeding our children highly processed foods high in sugar and in simple starch, right?
Right. Basically, all the rules apply. All the same rules apply.
I just want to clarify one thing that you said about cow's milk, regular supermarket milk. You're talking about just very young children there, right?
Right. Supermarket milk shouldn't be started until you're a year old. So before, in the first 12 months, just breast milk or formula. And then after 12 months, you can have supermarket milk and honey.
So this has been a really fascinating conversation. I'm very appreciative of your insights and expertise. Are there any resources you can recommend to parents or other people who are interested in learning more about what we've been talking about?
I think that important to think about when you're looking for resources online is trying to find medical sources for all of these things, because there's a lot out there. The microbiome has become a hot topic, and there are a lot of websites that discuss it, but they're not really evidence-based. So one that I found helpful and very easy to understand and read was one from the Harvard School of Public Health that had an excellent overview of the microbiome on their website and really went over a lot of the things that we discussed today in a very easy to understand way.
Oh, great. And we'll post the URL to that site on our website as we post the audio files from all of these shows. Well, Dr. Mariana Brewer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It was a great talk.
So Dr. Brewer is a neonatologist at Cone Children's Medical Center at Northwell Health, an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. For more information about this program and to find any of our past episodes, please visit medicine.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are welcome to send comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.